Very good evening and welcome to the 34th webinar on ICFAI's WiseViews interactive webinar series. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very distinguished leader with us today. Dr. Mukund Rajan is going to talk about the corporate India and the new focus on ESG. It's a very, very interesting topic and very difficult to understand. And we have requested Dr. Mukund Rajan to help us understand, appreciate, and also analyze how this emerging concern is going to affect all of us. Put your hands together if you can in a virtual mode and welcome Dr. Mukund Rajan to this webinar. Welcome, sir. I have with me Professor R. Prasad, is my senior colleague. Professor R. Prasad is the mentor and architect of the latest program we launched. It is the online MBA program. And we are also joined by some of the senior members from industry, academia, some professors from ICFAI system and outside as well. And a few more will keep joining. But we will start, sir, with your permission. So ladies and gentlemen, what I will do is I will make a brief introduction of the esteemed guest we have with us today. Allow me to share my screen. As I mentioned, the focus today is on this talk of ESG. It will be delivered by Dr. Mukund Rajan. About 20-25 minutes, we request Dr. Mukund Rajan to deliver his initial talk, followed by Q&A for the rest of the time till we hit 8:30 p.m. or 10 minutes more than that. I requested Mr. Rajan to answer a few questions beyond the stipulated time as well. This is the handsome picture of our guest today. I'm quite excited to read this profile. Believe me, I've been waiting for about 4 months to get this consent and schedule to bring in Dr. Mukund Rajan. I'm quite excited, very happy. It's my privilege and honor to present him today to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. So presently, Dr. Mukund Rajan is the chairman of ECube InvestmentAdvisors, a first of its kind platform which was created in 2019 to catalyze ESG changes in corporate India. Previously, he held positions at senior level throughout his 23-year-old career with the Tata Group, where he served as the first brand custodian of the Tata Group, chief ethics officer of the group, chairman of the Tata Global Sustainability Council and member of the Group Executive Council at Tata Sons. He also served on the boards of various Tata companies, including Tata Teleservices, Tata Communications, Tata SIA Airlines, and Tata AIG. Dr. Rajan serves as the chairperson of the Environment Committee of the FICCI and is a member of the Council of Management of the Forum of Free Enterprise. In terms of several achievements, we mention a few here. In 2007, Dr. Rajan was honored as a young global leader by World Economic Forum. He was also part of the inaugural class of the CII Aspen Institute India Leadership Initiative. And a brilliant academic track record, he obtained his BTech degree from the prestigious IIT Delhi in the year 1989, and subsequently he was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, where he earned his master's and doctorate in international relations. He published a few books. His doctoral dissertation, Global Environmental Politics, was published by Oxford University Press in 1996. His second book, The Brand Custodian, My Years with the Tatas, was published by HarperCollins in 2019. I have this book, sir, and I have your good wishes written on that book when you handed over this copy to me at Bangalore. His third book on corporate responsibility and ESG, titled Outlast: How ESG Can Benefit Your Business, was co-authored with Dr. Colonel Rajiv Kumar, which has just been published by HarperCollins. So, ladies and gentlemen, without taking much time, I would request Dr. Rajan to start his talk on this very interesting and emerging concern and the topic that we have with us today. Sir, I wholeheartedly welcome you and once again request you to please start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sudhakar. Really appreciate this opportunity, and it's obviously a topic that is quite hot, and I'm delighted that you've given me this opportunity in the week when the new book has just been released in the market. So love to have some discussions on that. I'm going to try and share my screen now because I have a presentation. So in a sense, I'm launching my book through you. Are you able to see the screen? Lovely. So thank you all once again. A real pleasure to interact with all of you today. And as I mentioned, what I'm going to do is over the next 20 odd minutes, really try and offer a perspective on really the rising importance of ESG for corporate India. And yes, as I mentioned, this is largely based on my most recent book, which is called Outlast: How ESG Can Benefit Your Business. Can you see the second slide as well? The slide shift is happening correctly? Okay, great. So as most of you would be aware, this term ESG is something that has really entered the lexicon in a big way in the last 2 years. Though in fact, the term itself has been around since the early 2000s. As most of you would be aware, the E in ESG is really environment. It encapsulates the natural resources a business consumes, the pollution it creates, increasingly now the focus on carbon emissions because of climate change, and many other environmental impacts. The S, or social, really refers to the links and ties that businesses develop with the local community, the way they treat their own people, and the focus on issues such as diversity and inclusion. And the G, the governance aspect, really deals with issues such as board effectiveness protocols, audit controls, approach to senior executive compensation, and appropriate reliance on independent directors. And these ESG issues, the reason they're so important is they are seen to critically influence the sustainability of businesses, and their performance on material ESG criteria really offer insights into their resilience in difficult times. In India, as we know, such resilience was severely tested during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic really exposed the excessive short-termism of many Indian businesses with limited financial reserves and an inability to really sustain overheads beyond a few weeks. The values that many in the corporate sector espouse really also came under scrutiny for the treatment of stakeholder groups like the migrant workers you see on the slide, or their decisions to terminate jobs. At one level, then, the pandemic ESG vulnerabilities of many Indian businesses. And if you dig deeper, you could even argue that India is actually in the midst of what many would describe as an ESG crisis. So if you start with governance, the G of ESG, I think the crisis is reflected in the volume of cases brought under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, the National Company Law Tribunal, well over 13,000 when I last looked at it, and the linked impact on the high non-performing assets in the Indian banking system, a big part of the reason for India's relative economic underperformance. And beyond just failed strategies, the concern is that too many companies have suffered from ethical misconduct and exceptionally weak corporate governance. If you turn to the E of ESG, unfortunately, the economic activity of corporate India has yielded some of the worst environmental indicators in the world. 22 of the 30 most polluted cities in the world in terms of air pollution are in India. And data from the Indian Council of Medical Research, ICMR, suggests that air pollution kills over 1 million Indians each year. If you turn to land, of India's landmass of 328 million hectares, just under half, around 147 million hectares, is undergoing some form of degradation due to deforestation, drought, and improper agricultural practices. And 21 of India's largest cities are projected to run out of groundwater, affecting over 100 million people. On the social dimension too, the S of ESG, India suffers from some of the worst indicators in the world. India, for instance, has one of the lowest levels of female participation in the workforce anywhere in the world at 22.2%. The global average is around 48.5%. Likewise, there has been poor absorption of representatives of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe communities in corporate workforces. And yet, the evidence on ESG is not all negative. the ESG crisis is stimulating important and mostly constructive reactions from stakeholders. For instance, growing public awareness and judicial activism are helping to force the pace of change towards better ESG practices. I think the issue of air quality in the national capital is a great example. Between temporary fixes like the odd even traffic congestion rules to reduce vehicular traffic on the roads, or the bans on diesel genset operation and on construction and demolition activities, and all the way to more permanent actions like the migration of the Indian auto industry from the Bharat Stage 4 to Bharat Stage 6 fuel emission standards, bypassing Stage 5 altogether, or the measures being promoted now across the country in different states to promote electric vehicles, or the scrappage policy is designed to get old polluting vehicles off the roads. A lot is being done to address the problem. And judicial pronouncements are also becoming more aggressive, as you can see from this quote on the slide from the Madras High Court's judgment on the case relating to Sterlite Copper's unit in Tuticorin. There are also strong regulatory tailwinds in favor of a powerful new focus on ESG in India. These include the 2018 National Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct, which were designed by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs to mainstream the concept of corporate responsibility. These guidelines have subsequently been integrated into the business responsibility and sustainability reports that the Securities and Exchange Board of India, SEBI, has directed the top 1,000 listed companies to publish from this fiscal on a voluntary basis and from the next fiscal on a mandatory basis. Parallelly, regulations with a significant focus on good governance are also influencing the conduct of Indian corporates. So the key regulators, including SEBI, the insurance regulator, IRDAI, and the pension fund regulator, PFRDA, have all defined stewardship codes which emphasize ESG requirements for institutional investors across the mutual fund, insurance, and pension fund sectors in India. And if you go by one indicator, like the rising against votes, so not for, but against, by these investors on EGM and shareholder resolutions, they are now beginning to flex their muscles. In similar way, the 2013 amendments to the Indian Companies Act strengthened the hands of minority shareholders, for instance, mandating the approval of related party transactions by special resolution. And as a consequence, in recent quarters, we've all seen minority shareholders express their upset on matters such as unreasonably high management compensation packages, which they proceeded to vote down, or voted out directors up for re-election who they felt did not discharge their responsibilities adequately. India has in fact been rated amongst the best countries in the world in terms of shareholder rights protection in the World Bank's Doing Business 2020 report. The 2013 Companies Act amendments also stipulated mandatory rotation of auditors to improve the quality of audits and reduce the risk of auditor-client collusion. And keeping Indian corporates on their toes are a clutch of what you might describe as activist funds and proxy advisory firms that are demanding better accountability. I think all of us will recollect the efforts of Elliott Management, the activist fund that took a strong position on the strategy of Cognizant and essentially forced that company to use some of its free cash flows to buy back shares in 2017. And it's worth noting that in the next 4 years after that initial intervention by Elliott, the entire Indian IT services industry, which is cash rich, as we all know, has on the whole undertaken share buybacks in excess of 100,000 crores. So huge impact by one activist firm focusing on one issue in the Indian market. And I think you're going to see much more of that in the years ahead. Now, all of this is domestic, but changes in the Indian ESG landscape are also being catalyzed by actions of stakeholders overseas. And I think one of the most critical drivers of this is the increasing concern about global environmental issues. Now, these are unique because they impact the whole world. No single country on its own can successfully address them. So cooperation between nations is a must. The argument is really the same as what you're hearing in COVID. Nobody is safe until everybody is safe. And examples, of course, include issues like ozone depletion, the loss of biodiversity, tropical deforestation. But clearly, climate change caused by global warming is the most pressing concern just now. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has underlined the need to go well beyond the 2015 Paris Climate Treaty target, which at that time was set at 2 degrees of global warming by the turn of the century. And now really the focus is on bringing the target down to 1.5 degrees and no more. We're seeing the impact of this in the European Commission's recent adoption of a proposal for a carbon border adjustment mechanism to address the climate change crisis. We're seeing it in the regulatory actions of countries like the United Kingdom, which recently announced at Glasgow that UK-listed companies must release net zero plans by 2023. And I think it's only a matter of time before regulators and supervisors elsewhere follow that same example. We're seeing it in the higher sustainability standards, which multinational enterprises like Unilever and Nestle, which have declared 2039 and 2050 as the target years for achieving net zero, are demanding from their supply chain participants in India. We're seeing it in the thrust of lenders on reporting of material climate-related risks by businesses in their financial filings. We're seeing it in the behavior of investment funds, which are demanding greater carbon disclosure and strong mitigation measures. And some have already started decarbonizing their portfolios, like Norges Bank. We're seeing this in citizen movements that have evolved around the world, such as the one that persuaded the UK Parliament to declare a climate emergency, or the school strike made famous by Greta Thunberg. So India, as the third largest greenhouse gas producer in the world, after China and the United States, is going to be key to how the world will resolve the problem of global warming. And so we saw at the recent 26th Conference of Parties, or COP26 on climate change in Glasgow, the Indian government really announcing a significant enhancement in its earlier targets adopted after the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015. So now India has declared that 2070 will be the target date for achieving net zero status, and is promised to generate 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel-based energy, with 50% of the energy mix coming from renewables by the same year, all while improving the energy efficiency of the economy by 45% over 2005 levels by 2030 again. And India is also anchoring the International Solar Alliance, where it's promoting this new concept of one sun, one world, one grid. Now, beyond global environmental issues, thanks to the interconnectedness of markets, overseas stakeholders are influencing other aspects of the agenda of corporate India on ESG. So these include customers across the globe who are increasingly demonstrating a preference to embrace what are called purpose-driven brands, brands like Patagonia or The Body Shop. And this is also the reason a market leader like Unilever resolved last year that each of its 70,000 consumer products around the world would carry labels showing their carbon footprint. The international business community's sense of global risks over the past decade has also evolved, now include many ESG-related risks. So where in 2009 and 2010, only one societal risk, which is chronic disease, was reported by the members of the World Economic Forum, and no environmental risk featured in the top 5 in terms of impact. By 2021, you can see 4 of the top 5 risks are related to societal or environmental issues. On issues of corporate malfeasance and abuses, again, foreign governments are now responding with strong new legislation and compliance requirements. And very often now, these come with cross-jurisdictional and extraterritorial impact. So, for instance, under the UK Bribery Act, it's entirely possible for Indian companies to be prosecuted in the United Kingdom for corrupt practices in totally different geographies, let's say a country in Africa. merely by virtue of their having a small footprint in the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, you have activists and nonprofits who want to hold Indian companies to account for their ESG lapses. There have been many campaigns conducted internationally against Indian companies, including companies in, for instance, the mining space, companies in the plantation space that have allegedly failed to meet threshold standards of corporate responsibility. And likewise, I think we all remember, and it's still impactful, the hashtag #MeToo campaign, championed on social media, which quickly went viral around the world, and in India as well, felled some prominent Indian personalities. Indian businesses are also being asked to perform on what are called the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, defined by the United Nations, traversing issues ranging from poverty alleviation to addressing climate change. The SDGs have essentially fused global with the local and created an interest of the international community in the way in which local issues are now being addressed within countries. Foreign investors are also making their preferences clear. Over $100 trillion of invested funds around the world have now subscribed in one form or the other to the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, of the UNPRI. Now, these are principles that require investors to incorporate ESG issues into their investment analysis and their decision-making processes. The European Commission has recently put out regulations that require all asset managers in the European Union to disclose the ESG performance of their investment portfolios, which of course include many Indian companies. So I think we should expect in the years ahead that Indian businesses that are non-compliant on critical ESG issues will be progressively excluded from the investment portfolios of the largest fund managers in the world. At the same time, I think the Indian market is likely to see significant impact from foreign investors seeking promising ESG stocks that offer good risk-adjusted returns. So you will also see an inflow of capital to better managed ESG-focused companies. And this last is actually a trend that has picked up momentum. And there's now a great deal of academic literature, which we also cite in our book, to show that a greater focus on ESG typically yields greater resource use efficiency, lower cost of operations, reduced risk, lower cost of borrowing, and greater prospects for valuation re-rating, which is really where the investors are interested, the hope to get alpha by investing in these stocks. And if you look at the Indian market, though it's quite a nascent space still, I think some evidence is there from the consistent outperformance of the MSCI India ESG Leaders Index. And you can see that that outperformance has actually increased with time. So when you compare it to the broader benchmark index, for most periods of time, since the inception in 2007, including the past 3, 5, and 10-year periods, the ESG Leaders Index has outperformed. And you're seeing this also with the NSE, the National Stock Exchange's Nifty 100 ESG Index, when compared to the Nifty 100 Index. So in a sense, capital, both as equity and as debt, will be allocated in the future primarily towards well-governed Indian companies that contribute to the goals of a more sustainable economy and society. Forward-looking Indian companies, I think, are recognizing these multiple pressures for change coming from stakeholders both in India and overseas. So what do these forward-looking companies really do different? First, I think very simply, they accept the need for change. And I think a great example is India's largest private sector company, Reliance Industries, which has acknowledged the climate change issue and set itself a target to become net carbon zero by 2035. Next, they put in place the right governance structures to develop and execute ESG strategies that are relevant for them, spanning what are called material ESG issues. And these material ESG issues will vary across sectors. So climate change may be a material ESG issue for a large fossil fuel-based energy consumer, like a steel company, but it may not have quite the same relevance for, say, a company that offers, let's say, web design services. You're also seeing that to create a governance focus, a number of companies are now beginning to create ESG committees of the board. So companies like Infosys, Ashok Leyland, most recently, I think Airtel, have all created ESG committees of the board. The focus on good governance really includes investment in training and strong evaluation protocols, diversity right at the top, including in board composition, and an adequate complement of well-qualified independent directors and a strong chairperson. This is something Mr. Narayan Murthy keeps talking about, and I have great sympathy for that. Strong chairpersons can make a great deal of difference. And I think this will also get linked to a requirement which the Indian public markets have from next year to separate the roles of chairperson and CEO. So it becomes even more important to have powerful chairpersons of boards. And of course, deployment of a well-designed code of conduct and an ethics framework that addresses common issues in the Indian context, including typically dignity and respect at the workplace, conflict of interest, bribery and corruption, and the need to have a strong whistleblower mechanism in place. We also see a greater focus in forward-looking businesses on resource use efficiency and embracing what are called circular economy practices that really focus on minimizing waste and extending life of products across product life cycles. And through this, they also de-risk as much as possible the volatility that we see in raw material and commodity prices currently. So they try and attach irrelevant costs to natural resources. Increasingly, that's happening through internal carbon pricing in terms of carbon emissions. And these companies also are beginning to prioritize better design for reuse, repair, and recycling of waste. They also recognize that many ESG enhancement measures actually don't require a great deal in terms of capital. And many investments in renewable energy or energy efficiency improvement, a great example is the shift to more energy efficient lighting solutions with LEDs, actually have high returns on investment and can pay for themselves typically within a year. You also see these businesses now increasingly embracing their supply chains in their progressive actions. I think in India particularly, you have to recognize that micro, small, and medium enterprises really form a significant part of the supply chain. They account for around half the actual resource consumption that takes place within the economy. Forward-looking companies are also constantly looking out for new and innovative practices and pivoting their business models on occasion to really find competitive advantage. So when Tata Power, for instance, found itself at the receiving end of portfolio decarbonization initiatives, including, by the way, by Norges Bank that I mentioned earlier, it chose to pivot towards renewable energy and away from coal-fired thermal power. The same company, very interestingly, is also now trying to build non-traditional collaborations, offering green power to subscribers who are willing to pay a higher price per unit of electricity. Forward-looking enterprises are also endeavoring to improve diversity within their workforces, and this includes gender diversity, the employment of more representatives of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe communities in India, and the recruitment of those who are physically challenged. I think visionary leaders really recognize that these kinds of endeavors don't cost much, but they deliver outsized gains, including in employee motivation, brand value, and reputation. Just as global leaders like Microsoft and Indian companies like Marico are now doing, the best companies are also linking ESG performance on critical issues like carbon emission reduction and workforce diversity improvement to appropriately benchmark executive compensation. And of course, integral to the link with compensation is a strong focus on measurement of ESG parameters that are material to their operations, tracking performance over time and making transparent disclosures. There are multiple reporting frameworks being used, including the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, or Integrated Reporting, IR. A universal framework is now likely in the next couple of years through the International Sustainability Standards Board that was just announced at Glasgow. But in the meantime, I think the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Report, the BRSR mandated by SEBI, will offer a very valuable tool in the Indian market for Indian businesses that seek to communicate their ESG commitment. In the past, there have been allegations often of non-transparency of disclosures and what is called greenwashing. I think with the guidelines now issued by SEBI for the preparation of the BRSR reports, any gaps will be scrutinized intently by a varied set of stakeholders, including regulators, analysts, proxy firms, activist funds, the media, and others. And you can expect both naming and shaming, as well as withdrawal of investments when the gaps are particularly egregious. Meanwhile, a clutch of decision support service entities, think of MSCI, Sustain Analytics, now in India, CRISIL, Acuite, and others are processing the voluminous data that's becoming available on ESG performance and coming out with ESG ratings. So forward-looking businesses, I think, are engaging with all these ratings providers and ensuring that they provided the appropriate data so that they can secure fair ratings. So I'm going to conclude now by really emphasizing that ESG indicators are becoming a critically important measure of how businesses are performing. As the principle of shareholder primacy gets overtaken by a modern standard of corporate responsibility that focuses and advocates value creation for all stakeholders, I think corporate India will have to move very swiftly to embrace this new focus on ESG. So let me stop there, Sudhakar, and thank you all very much for so patiently listening to me. I'll also stop sharing my screen, and then I'd love to get into some.
Wow, great. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for giving a detailed account of the ESG landscape within India and how it is interlinked with the emerging issues from around the world. You have mentioned that India is already in the midst of a certain crisis in terms of the parameters on each of these ESG concerns. And also you have painted a picture of optimism with respect to the emerging judicial activism, regulatory push, and some of the positive things that are taking place on ground, which gives us a promise that actually we are moving in the right direction, if not in terms of the magnitude, if not in terms of the tangible size of what is happening. That's a pretty interesting account. And also you have shared with us how forward-looking companies will have to focus on all these parameters, especially in terms of pollution, in terms of their commitment to reducing emissions, and also transparently reporting all the disclosures through various fora and formats that are available, which are internationally and within India also are accepted. Now, large organizations and medium organizations have started showing positive signs of these disclosures and their commitment. On one hand about E, on the other about the governance, especially to bring in the diversity in the workforce and their practices on board. I think these are pretty important and sharp lessons for all the stakeholders who are actually part of this wonderful webinar today to learn from. And also the finale with which you've said that the value creation for all stakeholders is an overriding concern. Why we are doing all these things is towards creating value for all the stakeholders and actually take everyone along with us. So that is a very nice summary on ESG and where we stand, sir. Thank you very much for this initial talk. I will now request Professor R. Prasad to come in and we can begin the moderation. The kind of time that is available for us is a concern always, and especially when an overwhelming speaker like you is amidst us. So we have to be conscious of all these timelines. Professor Prasad, over to you. Professor Prasad is an alumnus of IIT Bombay and IIM Calcutta. He was an entrepreneur. Later, he worked with corporate, and he also continues to now work in academics. He, as I said, is the professor and mentor for the online MBA program, which he architected. It's a fully online MBA program. Over to you, Professor Prasad. Please initiate the moderation.
It's a great pleasure and privilege speaking to you, Dr. Rajan. We have a large number of questions which have come in at the time of registration, and we have tried to organize it. This is more at a country level to understand the the contours of where we are right now. So the question is, what is the position on policy and statutory measures to achieve the net zero target by 2070, And how is India faring at present compared to China, Brazil, or other countries in this cohort?
So 2070 was announced only at Glasgow. And my understanding is that it came as a surprise even to some of the senior bureaucrats in India. So it was pretty much an announcement made very late in the day after India had sort of prepared its position and strategy for Glasgow. So there isn't a huge amount of work that has happened as yet. We, however, had the benefit of a conversation with the Environment Secretary, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, a couple of weeks back, where he has told us that the government is now working on a roadmap for achievement of net zero by 2070. And they're conscious. I think the 2070 goal is something that's a little bit out in time, so they have a lot of time to deal with that, but they're conscious that the 2030 goals are, in a sense, more aggressive and much more likely to be sort of tested and measured for gradual performance over the next few years. And therefore, a little bit of anxiety is creeping in whether India will be ready to demonstrate performance on the 2030 goals, including the 50% renewable in the energy mix and the energy efficiency improvement of 45% over 2005 levels. So they're starting to, put things together. It's worth also remembering that in some ways, this is not necessarily a very new issue for India, though it's become headline news only in the last 2-3 years, partly because of the extreme climatic events. But in fact, India has had a national action plan on climate change since 2008. And a number of missions were announced at that time, I think 8 missions, including the National Solar Mission, which sort of set the ground for a lot of the focus on renewable energy. So there's been a lot of activity across ministries, the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, the Ministry of Power. Many of these ministries have been working on these issues for a while. You've had schemes like the Perform Achieve Trade scheme for really energy serving certificates in various industries. The Bureau of Energy Efficiency has done some good work. EESL has done great work on the LED program, migrating a lot of the Indian lighting requirements to LEDs and saving energy as a result. So I think a lot of actions. The one concern I would have, apart from the fact that we don't yet have a whole of government approach on climate change and as yet a clear sort of strategy, because it's very new and it was just announced a month back. But the big concern I have is perhaps different parts of the government aren't necessarily fully aligned as yet in terms of these ambitious targets and what it will take to achieve them in the not very long period we have ahead of us, which is now, in fact, less than 9 years, almost 8 years. We're getting into 2022 very shortly. And let me give you an illustration of that. Just a few weeks before Glasgow, in the Indian Parliament, there was a great deal of rejoicing around the successful bidding of coal mining tenders. Now, coal, as we all know, is going to be a major problem area for India. And at Glasgow, in fact, there's a lot of focus on this fossil fuel. There's an effort to get some language to phase it out. And then India was the architect of some language that we would not phase it out, but we would phase it down. Now, in the context of the kind of measures and aggressive targets we've embraced, we are actually a few weeks before Glasgow celebrating the award of new licenses, which means coal mining is going to continue for a few decades. So forget about 2030, we're going to be mining coal probably in 2050. And the government said that at least 100,000 crores of new investment would come into that industry. Now, that doesn't square exactly with the idea of a very climate-friendly set of efforts. So I think in government, there will have to be a careful relook at what is happening industry by industry. And you'll have to see what is the most efficient way of getting towards the commitments we've already made and announced internationally, with also the least amount of hardship and impact on people. So in coal, you can understand a big player, for instance, is Coal India Limited, a public sector unit. They generate, I'm told, over 50,000 crores in taxes for the government. They employ almost 300,000 people. They operate in some of the most backward parts, backward districts of India, big employment provider. They have several million pensioners who depend on their continuing profits to get their pension. So it's not going to be an easy asked to tell them to stop mining coal or tell them to stop expanding their operations. So this is where this concept of a just transition, finding a way to get industries that are in problem situations to evolve to something that is more acceptable and reskill the labor that may get displaced otherwise and offer them new livelihood options. So I think it's early days as yet, but what we would be looking for is a clear framework and strategy, which hopefully the government will include the private sector before it finally firms up. So there should be a lot of detailed consultation with the private sector, and then announce a game plan and ensure that all parts of the government are aligned in the way in which that game plan gets executed. Not that one ministry is doing something one way, another ministry is pursuing totally different objectives, and sometimes these are contradictory or even clashing with each other. You saw a similar problem in the case of GST. When electric vehicles, the GST was first imposed, it almost treated electric vehicles as a luxury product, and the GST was very high. And it was only later, after a lot of protests from the public, that the GST was brought down. So you need to harmonize all your strategies and plans across multiple sectors and ensure that we're all hauling in the same direction, while also taking care of those who get left out, potentially left out. Hopefully they don't get permanently left out in that process.
Thank you very much. I think this is quite a bit of perspective in terms of how the participating members understand it. We are in very early days. We have differing interests, we have differing directions, and there needs to be an alignment, harmony in what we do. And then we need to, most importantly, come to a game plan and a roadmap as outcomes. Yeah, right. So when we look at all this, the variances and the diversity of the interests that India has, how do we compare with some of the other economies on a similar scale?
I think again we are relatively backward given the size of our economy. I mean, just to give you one data point, China is probably the most comparable economy to ours. They've announced a net zero year of 2060, so 10 years earlier than us. But in the meantime, what they've done in China, today the renewable energy capacity in China is around 700,000 gigawatts. We just crossed 100,000 2 months back. So it gives you the scale of the difference between two sort of similar sized populations. If you look at what's happening in many of the developed markets, the European Union, for instance, they are now aiming to not just start slowing down their emissions, actually aggressively cutting emissions. And they've got serious programs that will help them to do that. I gave some illustrations of the UK, for instance. By 2023, all listed companies in the UK will have to offer net zero transition plans. By 2025, all financial services entities in the UK have to start reporting as per the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures and talk about both the physical risks and the transition risks of their books. Now, these are very far-reaching interventions from a regulatory perspective. And I think India, in that sense, is still quite behind in terms of its focus. Where it can hurt us is take this proposition, for instance, of a carbon border adjustment mechanism in the European Union. What they're essentially saying is we are going to put tariffs on products that get imported into the EU from markets that don't have the same standards as we have in the EU on carbon emission control. Now, tomorrow, if that starts impacting Indian exports, then I think there will be serious consequences for the economy. So I think we have to pull up our socks quickly. We don't have too much time, which is why it's even more important that we create this framework. The government enlists the collaboration and support of the private sector, and we announce our own plans to get to these aggressive targets to 2030 without much more loss of time. And in terms of the impact of climate change, I mean, we've seen extreme climatic events in this country increase in frequency. I live in Mumbai, and so many of the Mumbai citizens will tell you that it is unheard of to have cyclones in this part of the country. And suddenly in the last 2 years, you've had 2 cyclones. So I think that just tells you that these issues are here to stay with us. The impact can be frightening. You've seen in the last few weeks, unprecedented floods, for instance, in Chennai, the same level of rainfall that they had in 2015. When homes get flooded and you don't have access to drinking water, you don't have access to food and supplies, it can be quite traumatic. So I think we are seeing now the pain that can be caused, and this is just the beginning. So without much further loss of time, I think we all need to pull together and then find the right strategy and execute well on that.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan, for reinforcing the urgency. I think you gave us some sort of a position of where India is compared to China and also some of the European countries. You've also highlighted the risk, the hurt that can be caused, and therefore the threat which is there, and therefore the need of the hour. Now we come to the corporate aspect of it. When you look at this sort of a situation which is there overall, where do you situate the corporate India, the role to be played by corporate India?
So that's why I gave the examples of what forward-looking companies are doing, because I think the best companies don't necessarily view this as a crisis. They also view it as an opportunity. So much is going to change, but if you can be an early mover in embracing that change, you can actually be ahead of the curve. I mean, look at what companies like Reliance and Adani have announced on green hydrogen. It's a very nascent space, but they're already making very big bets. They're looking at acquisitions overseas. They're hiring some great talent. So I think that's what the best companies will do. They won't sort of worry about, the problems are going to lie ahead because of these issues. They're going to look at where is the opportunity to be smart about it and to really embrace change rather than be fearful of it. So that is the starting point. I think every company has to accept that change is here to stay with us. In our book, we in fact say that the situation you face today is not dissimilar to what you had 30 years back with liberalization. And the companies, if you look at India's biggest corporate names in 1990, 1991, and then you look at 2000, 2001, you'll find the vast majority of them had vanished from the league tables of the top 10, top 20, top 30. And this was because these are companies that are unprepared for change. Now, this time around, again, I think you're going to see the same situation. It's those who are willing to take risk, to bet a little bit of capital and do the right thing, forward-looking, who will succeed. And those who assume that all this is not going to change anything are the ones who are going to be, I think, excluded from the markets fairly soon. And a whole bunch of stakeholders, investors, financiers, customers. Today's millennials are so aware, they're going to stop buying your products if they don't sense that you have a social conscience. So I think all this is very important. I think the smarter companies get it. But the good news to an extent is that the larger companies are in a sense seeing the light. And if they sort of press for change and hopefully pull their supply chains along with them, you'll see the large part of the Indian business world sort of migrating in the right direction. The hope is it'll happen in large enough numbers and it'll happen fast enough that these companies don't get excluded to the benefit of maybe overseas companies. So we'll keep our fingers crossed on that.
Thank you for highlighting the early work done by the leaders, and how the rest of us can look at that and then take it forward. Can we look at which are the sectors in India which you will see being more impacted by this and therefore need to take earlier action, and some of the other sectors?
I mean, the obvious ones that get hugely impacted are oil and gas, anything that's dependent on fossil fuels, thermal power. Then there are some industries that rely a lot but don't have solutions easily available. The steel industry is the case in point. Aluminium, cement. These are industries that use a whole lot of fossil fuels, and there aren't easy solutions even to move towards hydrogen, for instance. But they're doing a lot of work, a lot of pilot projects, R&D that's going on. So I think some of India's largest industries could get impacted. Look at the entire automotive industry. Again, the shift towards electric vehicles away from the internal combustion engine. I think many of those industries and the component suppliers who service those industries, again, are going to be seriously impacted when that shift happens.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan. We come to the end of this cluster. We are very cognizant of the time. I hand it back to Professor Rao for the next cluster.
Thank you. Dr. Mukund Rajan has been quite comprehensive in terms of the response to the first cluster of questions. And so some of them have actually been ticked in the cluster that I'm going to ask a few questions from. Therefore, we will save some time. And one thing is that is being asked by one of the participants is the attempt to be ESG compliant only to get cheaper finance and comply to the regulatory norms. Is the corporate India, what he meant, is really into balancing the triple bottom lines?
No, so I think the best companies are responding to multiple instincts. And this goes back to the issue of trying to create value for all stakeholders. But you will have a bunch of companies that start with what is called a tick the box approach, where they just try and do enough so that the regulator doesn't pull them up, so that they're seen reasonably well in the markets, they get the right sort of ESG ratings, and they're not penalized by investors. But there are many more companies that also go beyond and are doing it for the right reasons, because they see that this is actually in the long term going to help their brand, going to help their reputation, going to help their recruitment possibilities. And you can create value by identifying new business opportunities in some of these emerging spaces. So I think there will always be a concern with some companies why they're doing it, but hopefully more and more companies will see the light and do it for all the above reasons, not just to make more money or to get more investments.
Hopefully more and more companies will see the reason and very genuinely get into the act of doing it, rather than just the greenwashing that we usually call.
Correct.
Sir, the next question is about the kind of investments that the ESG sector is attracting, especially the investment across the clean tech spaces over the last 10 years. If you can give us some perspective on that.
So the question is again, what kind of investments have been taking place in clean tech?
Investment across clean tech spaces in India.
So, I talked about the National Solar Mission, for instance, which really resulted in a boom in solar power. And, we crossed 100 gigawatts of renewable energy a couple of months back on the strength of a lot of those missions to focus on renewable energy, including solar and wind power. And I think that's worked out really well. Initially, in the early days, in 2006, 7, 8, 9, that kind of period, I think getting finance for many of these projects was really a struggle. But I think over time, it's become much easier. The banking system has got more comfortable with technology. And many of the large renewable energy players have, I think, been very well funded. And now it's a thriving industry, so much so that even the costs have now come down to, I think, some of the lowest tariffs in the world that we can offer on the strength of renewable energy. So obviously the industry has benefited. A lot of private equity capital that's come into that space. Where you still have a challenge, though, is the smaller scale clean tech. So think about rooftop solar, or think about waste to energy solutions, off-grid solutions. Those, I think, are still struggling. If you look at rooftop solar, if you look at even on electric, battery storage solutions, these are all relatively new in terms of technology. And I think the banking system sometimes struggles with new technology. They don't want to take a risk if they're not very sure how it's going to turn out. So you don't have sort of big backers for new battery technologies in India so far. Then you'd hope that maybe the NBFCs from the private sector would step in and sort of fill that gap. Unfortunately, in the last 3 years, many of the NBFCs have been hit hard, earlier because of the economic slowdown and NPAs, and now because of COVID. So there is a challenge in securing financing for some of these newer solutions. You need a lot of risk appetite. Some of it will obviously be provided by the private equity and venture capitalists, but small ticket funding, I think typically tends to be a continuing problem in India today. So I think it's going to take some time before we see a better evolution of some of those parts of the industry. But the utility scale renewables, very well funded, fairly mature, which is the reason you're getting some terrific tariffs now.
Great, sir. So the utility scale big ticket investments are fairly good from struggle to ease, whereas rooftop clean tech kind of a small ticket struggling because it has to evolve. It's a function of time.
Correct.
Thank you, sir, for that response. Are there any other issues in implementation which we have missed out in our initial discussion and in the questions subsequently also, which India faces now, both in terms of corporates and also non-corporate sector?
In terms of implementation, I think one is, of course, the fact that our whole reporting system is still, it's not yet fully born, right? We've had what have been called the business responsibility reports for the last 8 or 9 years. But it's the first time that now we're introducing a very strong sustainability dimension in those, and hence the business responsibility and sustainability reporting paradigm that SEBI is promoting. But this year it's voluntary and it only really kicks in mandatorily from next year. So there isn't that much information that is available in the Indian market for analysts, for investors, for the retail investors, for the public at large, non-profits, policy institutions, to really comment on how good or how bad Indian corporates are. And so in some ways, many companies have got away with it because there hasn't been that much information that they've been obliged to put out. And even when they've done a very shoddy job of putting out information, even under the earlier business responsibility reporting paradigm, there were no consequences. So if you did a lousy report, there wasn't any penalty from SEBI, for instance, leave alone anything stronger than that. There were no financial consequences even for doing a terrible job. I think all that's going to now change. There's going to be much more pressure. And because these issues are so much more urgent, people are not going to now accept very poor performance on these issues. So I think one dimension is obviously the whole reporting framework and how quickly it comes up to speed so that investors, the government, regulators, customers can make more informed choices going forward. A second aspect, which I think would be nice to see, is much more focus on the information customers get. I'm quite impressed by Unilever's commitment to really put these labels, for instance, on all their products on their carbon footprint, because they're taking a stand that, I'm going to educate my customer, and perhaps some customers will walk away because they are not happy about the kind of performance they're seeing. But they're willing to take that chance. But by being the first to do it, and by pulling or dragging the supply chain to collaborate with them and allowing this to happen, they're actually going to be ahead of the rest of the pack. So by setting higher standards for yourself, it can be costly initially, but it can give you a huge market advantage because their hope is that more customers will embrace Unilever products because they are much more transparent and open. And I think in India, we are yet to see strong movements at the customer level around these kinds of issues. It would be good to see a lot more activity around that. And it starts with naming and shaming, but it goes all the way through, as I said later, to investors pulling out if they think that some companies have very suspect products which aren't going to continue to gain acceptance in the market. So before it's too late, they sort of pull out, and then it starts sending very strong signal that only the right behavior will get rewarded, bad behavior will get punished quite strongly.
Great, sir. Thank you. We are at a very nascent stage of the reporting system in terms of compliance to reporting itself. We fall severely short on information across various sectors. But one good thing is the BRR moving to BRSR. I mean, that itself is one positive shot.
Yeah, and the link thing on BRR to BRSR is obviously more broadly across the market. And this is true not just of sustainable products and services, true about every aspect of life in India is enforcement. I think you just see that it's very variable across the states. It's sometimes very variable across the central ministries. Some laws are enforced very strongly. Many laws don't get enforced at all. And that then obviously leads to a huge amount of problem and also subjectivity when issues do get addressed. So, but that's, hopefully the evolution that democracy sees as you get better and better at creating legislation and enforcing it.
Great. So on one hand, legislation, the other one is to have the teeth to actually implement the same. Thank you very much, sir. I would not like to take much of time by summarizing it. I'll hand it over to Professor Prasad for the next cluster of questions, and I'll quickly come back if he permits me.
Sure.
Professor Prasad.
Thank you. I think this question is about reporting itself, and I think some in the audience would like to know which are those 2 or 3 dimensions or aspects of the BRSR which kicks in financial year 22-23, which will make the kind of impact that we are talking about.
Yeah, take an issue like climate change. So in the BRSR, you have what will be essentially essential reporting requirement. And then there are leadership indicators that on a voluntary basis you can report. So most companies are expected to certainly disclose in the scope 1 and scope 2 carbon emissions. But a leadership indicator will be if you report on scope 3 emissions. So you will have a basis to figure out which companies are reporting only scope 1 and 2, which companies are also reporting scope 3. And then that starts creating a basis by which you can compare and contrast companies in the same industry, companies across industries, provide that information to analysts, to investors, to customers, And then they start making their choices based on that information. Today in the Indian market, there is no obligation on companies to offer this kind of information. But tomorrow with the BRSR, it will be there and it will be public and it will be transparent. Everybody can look at it and comment on it. So I think that's the kind of difference that will happen once you have much more data transparency.
I think the next question is about, something about the challenges. We have this roti kapda makan issues. We also have a lot of political issues. There's one question in the chat box also about the dichotomy as far as ESG is concerned. The harm is caused by one segment, and there are others who bear the impact of it, and they don't understand much of it. So how do you resolve this dichotomy so that these issues get resolved?
Ultimately, my view is you go back to basics. If you're a democracy, the only way you can ultimately resolve these issues is for all political parties to understand the implications and educate the voters, and then let the voters participate in voting for the parties that have the best strategies and plans. And it may vary from state to state. I think that's incredibly important. 3 years back, I wrote an article for the Hindustan Times on why does India not have a green party? And actually, when you think about it, it's a little strange. I mean, you have green parties everywhere in the world, but you don't have one green national party in India. The Greens have really been resurgent in Europe. Today, they control governments, including governments in Germany, one of the most powerful industrialized nations in the world. And yet in India, which has so many sustainability linked issues, you don't have a green party. The next best option is then to ensure that the manifestos of all the large national parties have a strong communication on what they think should be done on these issues of, who wins, who loses, which sectors will benefit, which sectors may get penalized, how to achieve net zero in the years ahead. So I'm hopeful that, fairly soon we'll see much more activity on the part of civil society and much greater involvement of our youth. After all, they are the ones who are going to inherit the world that we're going to leave them. And if they don't get involved in politics and in trying to set the agenda, nobody's going to be able to, bail India out of the problems that lie ahead. So they must get involved, they must participate, and that would be ultimately the solution. Everything else we can talk about will be tactics, but fundamentally as a country, we need to understand and embrace what are the long-term goals for this country. And a big part of that will obviously be what kind of society you want to create. And that's why when I talked about ESG issues in India, the S dimension, such poor involvement of women in the formal economy, such poor involvement of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe community members in the power structure. These are all reflections of still a sort of evolving democracy. So we've got a lot of work to do to give a sense of much greater equity in society, and we're still far away from that.
I think there is some kind of light which has come up. You've highlighted the role of education. You've also highlighted the most important stakeholder group, the youth, and you've also shown a kind of a roadmap, some sort of activist group, and then getting into political party manifestos. Thank you for that. It's a very tricky question, and we all hope that we go the right way.
Correct.
The next question is about what are the best governance practices to achieve environmental sustainability and social transformation.
So I gave the example of companies now that are increasingly creating a focus at the level of the board on ESG. So you have ESG committees of the board, companies like Ashok Leyland, Infosys, Airtel most recently. So I think you start with, the tone at the top has to be right. So if the board is not seized of the importance of the issue, it's unlikely that management is going to take it seriously. So you start with creating a locus of responsibility at the level of the board, and it could be an ESG committee. It need necessarily be that, though. You have companies like NTPC or in Tata Steel that have given this responsibility to the CSR committee and included sustainability in the CSR committee's agenda. So one is creating that locus of attention. Obviously, based on that, finding the right group within the senior leadership team, ideally led by the CEO, to own up to this agenda and to then come back with a policy, a strategy, and an execution plan that they get the board's blessings on. Linked to that is the point I made about compensation, because if people don't see dollar signs attached to outcomes, they're not going to take it as seriously. So you have to ensure that the ESG outcomes promised as a result of that strategy and the execution is linked to the compensation that the executives ultimately get paid. So that's how you sort of start putting the basics of governance in place. But the best companies, you see that this cascades all the way down to the last man in the company, the last woman in the company on the shop floor. You want to ensure that everyone is singing, in a sense, from the same hymn book. And you have multiple ways in which you do that. So again, the tone at the top is important, the kind of leadership commentary on these issues, frequent communication around those issues, then having the systems and processes in place, and then constantly measuring your performance and ensuring within the company, everyone understands how you're doing at any point of time. So constant improvement is the mantra. So you need all of that to come together, and then you really have an organization which is delivering quite well on these kinds of issues.
I think that's quite a comprehensive framework, starting from the ESG committee to the right team, to the compensation linked to that, and then the need to go around to the last mile, and for doing so, the communication, the systems, and the measures which are needed. Thank you very much. I think there are more questions, but I hand it back to Professor Rao.
Thank you very much. And the moment Professor Prasad hands it over to me, there's a big burden, big responsibility. We don't have time, but there is one whole bunch of questions waiting to be asked, sir. But I'll just come out of that and ask you one thing. The Scope 3 emissions, which relates to leadership commitment. There was a joke on social media that to attend the COP26, leaders from 50 countries have gone in their chartered flights.
Private jets.
So I believe that is also part of Scope 3 and the kind of actions that we demonstrate for the rest of the world and even for our own country and the corporates and people. I think that's a conflicting signal. But I'm sure in India, we have not even come to that stage because, as you rightly mentioned, the people movement is yet to find its feet on these particular, especially ESG aspects within India. So yes, sir, the one related question for S is pending here. I will raise that and then close the discussion after that with your permission. While the planet angle gets attention, what can be done to improve corporate practices? That part is addressed. We are growing in terms of corporate culture and good practices. Should we not imbibe social norms for increasing happiness index for our precious resources / employees?
Very good point. In fact, in my book, we talk about the fact that employee engagement in India is pretty poor, but honestly, it's pretty poor across most of the world. So it's not the India standards stands out too much, but there's a Gallup study a couple of years back which suggested that employee engagement was around 13%. So it suggests that the vast majority of the workforce is disengaged or not very well engaged with what they do. And a lot of that has to do with the point you made, that are people genuinely proud about their work? Are they feeling that they are included in the company's plans and strategies? Do they feel that from a compensation strategy framework, they're being treated equitably? And do they feel that they have a lot invested in the organization's success? Or are they really looking at it as a job for which they get payment and they couldn't care less what happens to the company in the future as long as they get the monthly salary? And then where they get happiness is actually outside of work, when they go back home or they go to their friends or they go to a club or whatever they do. And that's a big issue. I think the most successful companies, and there is enough research. For instance, the research based on Glassdoor, reports, the most successful companies which have high Glassdoor ratings from employees, both within the company and who left the company, have tended to dramatically outperform the rest of the crowd. So if you have an employee force that is happy at work, I think you have a huge opportunity to shine in the market. Now, how do you create that happiness? And there, I think it goes back to the same approach, whether it's sustainability, whether it's an ethical work culture in the organization, whether it's a clear focus on performance. So much of it has to do with A, the tone at the top, B, walking the talk, C, the systems and processes you have in place to make people feel included, D, the communication around these issues and the importance they have, and finally measuring this and being able to report periodically that yes, we're becoming a happier organization, or no, we haven't made progress, and then trying to get feedback from employees on why this is the case. I think recently Harsh Goenka from the RPG group talked about how they are now focusing much more on happiness. It'll be great to see, some of the experiments they seem to be undertaking on trying to measure happiness within the organization. But it's like so many other things linked quite strongly to, the leadership and the kind of tone they set to the top. If they don't believe in these things, so much of India is very hierarchical in approaches and attitudes and the culture that they set, very dismissive of employee feedback. It's my way or the highway in many companies. Then you're unlikely to get a lot of this. But if the tone at the top is right and inclusive, I think so much of a difference can happen. And many of these companies can really survive and do really well for the long term. Because these are typically the companies where dissent is allowed, is encouraged. Therefore, big mistakes sometimes don't happen because you've taken a lot of input and feedback and avoided the wrong path. And these are the companies that invest more in R&D, invest more in innovation, and are usually ahead of the pack. So I think, a lot of this can come together, but you need to have the right leadership for that.
Great. I think that's a fantastic suggestion, recommendation, and prescription from you, sir. How to make people happy has always been a very big question. Last week on the same day, we were having a discussion with one HR consultant or employee productivity consultant, and that topic was people performance consulting or people performance modeling. And then one of the points that came up really was to conclude that these employees are not loyal to the organizations. And some of the reflections from the current discussion will actually go there to fit in, to serve as some indicative solutions, at least, to the way we engage the employees and work towards creating that happiness index, which one of the participants has asked for, and how you have given the 5 points very, very clearly spelled out. Thank you so much, sir. And what I will do now is, it is 8:45. I think we will wrap it up, sir, with your permission. Thank you very much for this superbly eloquent discussion on the pitch for ESG and the current position and the future pathways that we all have, both in India and abroad. And it has been well accepted. I can see some of the comments coming in the chat box. Super thrilled, and I think there's a great deal of clarity that has emerged after listening to you. Thank you so much for that. Overall, I think the shortcomings or the amount of focus that we have to put on, the less talked about is the S factor, that is the social, where people have to be treated equitably. The gender, for example, the participation of women, the participation of SCSTs, the participation of minorities in the power structure, and how do we enable that and how do we talk about it is something very, very interesting. And the second one out of the many suggestions is about the data transparency and this path led by the example of Hindustan Unilever in terms of sharing their labels on what is their progress on the carbon footprint. Initially, it could be problematic, but because of this transparency, I think the brand reputation will definitely go up. And then, after all, the whole discussion is for the long term. ESG is for the long term, and therefore they're in the right direction. I hope others emulate and many others pick up lessons from them and start working in that direction. And third and most important aspect is we are yet to see the customer level movements in this country, and this country is known for actually voicing their opinions, their positions, their stands. For example, the revolution that has started abroad has picked up reasonably well in terms of the Me Too movement. A similar one on these ESG parameters, especially on the S, especially on the E, and also to a great extent on G, will have to kick up at the customer level so that there is a pressure and there is that kind of impact on the leaders to actually take that feedback very seriously and implement that towards a sustainable future that we are all wishing for. Thank you very much, sir. And I have not forgotten the 5-step process that you mentioned. how to attain the happiness index, setting the right tone at the top, and walking the talk. Third one is creating the systems to make it very, very inclusive for all these groups. And the fourth one is the right communication in the organization, the discourse in the organization. And the last one is have a system to come up with the metrics and keep reporting that your happiness index comprising XYZ factors, we measured in 2020 so much, and in 2021 we have moved up. I think that kind of measurable systems will have to be brought in and take it as a very, very important responsibility on behalf of the board, on behalf of the organizations and all. Shareholders are important, but stakeholders are also important. I think for all of us, this has to be a very sustainable, enjoyable, participative, inclusive world. Thank you very much, sir, for this enlightening conversation and the talk that you have delivered today on the 34th webinar at ICFAI's WiseViews Interactive Series. We will come back to you with a few more questions on email without disturbing you. And we wish you all the best in the book launch that I'm sure you will plan out in the next few weeks. If possible, we have about 16 to 17 campuses pan-India. Anywhere, any city, one of the campuses can be the venue for your book launch if you feel so. We'll be too happy and proud to host you there as well, sir, across the country.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So have a good weekend and stay safe, everyone. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Mukund Rajan is the younger brother of Dr. Raghuram Rajan. I didn't want to mention that in the thought of
Sudhakar, I recognize Mukund. Hi, Mukund. Your side view is exactly like Raghu because he used to sit next to me at IIT in our electives.
All right.
Great work. In fact, I've shared Otto Scharmer's article as well as the ULab's initiative that is actually running under GEA, which has got a total relevance to ESG. And I have been asking Sudhakar also to get engaged through ICFAI University on that. Because when I set up the Center for Climate Change for this combined state of AP in 2009, one of the largest initiatives and trust was actually creating these courses which would target what are now called as the VUCA skills, which is essential for enabling ESG to happen. And let's do something together in this space because, in fact, I'm very happy also to announce I would like you to talk to Ranmal Jhala, who is the founder of the Green Party, along with Colonel Nautiyal. We are just getting our act together. Yeah, Uttarakhand. And their manifesto is there. I will share the manifesto as well as.
I've seen that, but what I'd hope for is a national party with a strong presence.
So I'm actually helping them create their various national chapters with the environmental focus. And I was requesting Ranmal Jhala also to join today, but I think I have missed informing him on time. But in case he doesn't, I will introduce him to Sudhakar, and maybe we can have a separate session with you as well as Prasad and Ranmal Jhala in the future. Thank you, Prasad. Wonderful program, ICFAI. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Sanjay. For a moment, I thought that IIT Delhi is ganging up out there. So, sir, I would like to thank you once again on behalf of everyone at ICFAI Group, including our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Registrar, and the President, and our Chairperson. We thank you from the bottom of our heart. We would like to meet you again and again.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So,
thank you.
So ladies and gentlemen, we will see you again next Friday at the same time, 7:30 p.m. with yet another creative leader, Mr. Sudarshan Patnaik. He is a sand artist of international standards, and he's going to share how artistry is going to build the collective consciousness of the society. And we will listen to him on December 17th at 7:30 p.m.
Well, I just came in at the end.
Okay, sir.
That's Mr. Ranmal Jhala, Sudhakar.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Jhala. Wonderful that you came in. Okay, I think I've just finished introducing you. Please go ahead. Maybe a few more minutes, Sudhakar.
I'm not a founder of the Green Party. I just joined a year ago. The Green Party has got presence in 25 states, but we are a young party. And I am one of the vice presidents and the co-convener for Gujarat. But it'll be nice to be in touch with you through Sanjay.
Great. Thank you, sir.
Welcome.
Thanks for welcoming us to your party. Thank you so much for joining. We look forward to meet you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.